Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. This weekend at UFC 290, Jalen Turner takes on Dan Hooker. And in the lead up to this fight, Dan Hooker did an interview with Ariel Helwani on the MMA Hour where he absolutely embarrassed himself. And not only did he embarrass himself, he also embarrassed and exposed Ariel Helwani for his blatant bias in his coverage of the Islam Makhachev IV allegations post UFC 284. Now, we are going to recap this entire situation. We are going to look at clips from this interview, and I was also able to dig up some pertinent clips from Alexander Volkanovski's manager discussing this situation as well that I think shed some light on this situation. But I want to, before we even do all that, I want to talk about Dan Hooker in general right now, because Dan Hooker, I think there's something going on with Dan Hooker, and I think he really embarrassed himself in this interview, but I think there's more to this story than that with Dan Hooker, because Dan Hooker has recently dyed his hair blonde. Dan Hooker has recently got a full back tattoo. Dan Hooker has recently tattooed both of his legs all the way up from his foot to his knees, and I really truly do believe that Dan Hooker is going through a midlife crisis, potentially mixed with CTE, because Dan Hooker, I mean, he's got to realize his UFC career is on the downslope. He's talking about, I was embarrassed to be offered Tony Ferguson. Tony Ferguson is on the downslope of his career. Tony Ferguson is getting up there in age. Tony Ferguson isn't what he used to be. And guess who that also applies to? That also applies to Dan Hooker. Dan Hooker, in his last few fights, have been getting stopped outside of the win over Claudio Puelles in his last fight. I mean, who doesn't even belong in the UFC? Dan Hooker got a win there. But before that, got absolutely smashed in the first round by Arnold Allen. Before that, got his arm ripped off by Islam Makhachev, where he screamed to the ref to stop the fight. And then you just go back and you see a KO from Michael Chandler. And then you see that absolute war against Dustin Poirier. And I truly believe that's where Dan Hooker lost his soul. He's taken a lot of damage over the course of his UFC career. But I genuinely believe right now with Dan Hooker and regarding this entire situation, I think Dan Hooker is going through a midlife crisis. And I also believe there might be some CTE taking effect on Dan Hooker. Now, the entire situation, I'm going to briefly recap it before I get into the clips from the interview, but I've done in-depth videos on this. I will link them down in the description if you care for a more in-depth analysis of all these different things that went on back towards UFC 284. But essentially, if you rewind back to February of 2023, at UFC 284, we got Islam Makhachev versus Alexander Volkanovski. Alexander Volkanovski is a teammate, training partner, and friend of Dan Hooker. Islam Makhachev goes out there. He beats Alexander Volkanovski via decision. I thought it was a pretty clear decision, but in some people's mind, it was a controversial decision because Volkanovski was a lot more competitive than people thought he would be going into the fight. And then afterwards, you have Dan Hooker making some allegations regarding Islam Makhachev cheating in the lead up to UFC 284. He put out a series of tweets. I'm not going to read them all, but I'll put them on the screen. Islam is a cheat. He doesn't cheat. He doesn't win. Prove me wrong. Bet you can't. And then he says Islam Makhachev hired a nurse in the lead up to UFC 284 in order to take a banned IV, which is banned under commission rules and was also thought to be banned under USADA rules. The only real statement that Islam Makhachev put out, he tweeted, "You must be held accountable for such accusations." And after this, you know, there was talk from the Hooker camp that there would be some evidence. They had a smoking gun. They had some receipts. But over the next few weeks, the only real evidence that people pointed to was a tweet from Ali Abdelaziz, who is Islam Makhachev's manager, where Ali tweeted out, he said, "For all the idiots out there, any fighter under the UFC banner can take 2 to 3 liters of IV as long as it's done by a nurse or a professional. Next week, I'm going to expose everyone. Islam Makhachev is the pound for pound king." And Ali Abdelaziz put out that tweet, and then he subsequently deleted it because it looked bad. And we're going to circle back to that tweet in a second. But Ariel Helwani tweeted out something when someone asked him, "What do you think of Ali Abdelaziz deleting this tweet?" And Ariel Helwani put out there, yes, he deleted it because someone, I would think, told him it was incriminating himself with this tweet. You can't take 2 to 3 liters by a professional or not. It's 100 milliliters per 12 hours, among other details. Massive difference. That's what Ariel Helwani said regarding Ali's tweet. So Ali's tweet, I looked up the rule. I double checked with Jeff Nowitzki's, description of the rule. I checked with USADA's website. And Ali Abdelaziz's tweet was accurate, unbeknownst to Ariel Helwani, who was saying that it was inaccurate. Now, I do think that tweet from Ali Abdelaziz doesn't look particularly good, but he's just reiterating the rule that people can take IVs. Now, in this case, Islam Makhachev cannot take an IV in Australia because it's against Australian Commission rules, but Ali Abdelaziz wasn't even in Australia. All he was saying was that the rule, it does exist, where people can take an IV under the guise or under, the advice of a medical professional. Now, I think people could abuse that system for sure, but that is the current rule. You can take a look at it on USADA's website yourself. I'm not going to read it out, but this is the USADA rule saying under a medical professional, you are able to take an IV. Well, that's pretty much the only evidence that Dan Hooker has ever presented. And he recently goes on the MMA Hour, and I'm thinking, oh, Ariel might ask him, where's the evidence, because now it's July, this all happened in February, and Dan Hooker was saying there needs to be an investigation and this and that, and Dan Hooker made some of the most embarrassing statements on the MMA Hour. I couldn't even imagine, it's only 2 minutes of clips or like a minute and a half of clips. I can't imagine embarrassing yourself this badly. He looked like a total fool, and so did Ariel Helwani, but we'll stick with Dan Hooker first. Let's take a look at the first clip.
Dropped several atomic bombs on the MMA community, and I was like, oh, that's what he was referencing. It went over my head because I didn't know what he was talking about. Could I ask what led you to do that? And in retrospect, do you have any regrets about any of that?
Yeah, I think I've said it. I think it's like out there that like whoever the nurse was got in touch with our team, and that was like going around our team, and we're like, oh, Volker's just like the nicest guy in the world. You know what I mean? He's not gonna go there and say anything. It's like even like Eugene's and like thinking, oh, how should we approach this? I said, hold my beer, boys. I'll show you how this is done. I know how to get the people going. Like, so I can't, there's definitely something there. You know what I mean? Just because you don't have like.
So we'll get back to the rest of that clip in a second, but you notice how he says, just because we don't have, and then he pauses, and then he goes on to another spiel, which we'll get to in a second. But what Dan Hooker was going to say there is just because we don't have any evidence doesn't mean it isn't true. The other thing I want to note from that first clip of Dan Hooker before we get into the rest of it, you notice Ariel Helwani, while he's talking about this, he's just giggling like a little schoolgirl. He can't get over how funny it is that Dan Hooker has said that Islam Makhachev cheated in the lead up to this fight. And now he's tainted the victory of Islam Makhachev with absolutely no proof. Ariel Helwani thinks it's the funniest thing in the world. But basically in that clip, Dan Hooker reiterates that a nurse told him that Islam Makhachev got an IV. That's the basis of the claim. A nurse told him that Islam Makhachev took an IV. That is it. And then he goes on to say, just because we don't have, and then he pauses real quick. And now let's take a look at what the rest of what he says.
I don't know what's going on behind the scenes or why it's not, why it didn't go any further. Maybe it didn't have like the evidence to get it over the line. You know what I mean? But that doesn't, where there's smoke, there's fire. It's, OJ Simpson's walking around, you know what I mean? Would you invite him to your family? Would you invite him to your family barbecue? Probably not.
So there Dan Hooker goes on to say, oh, well, just because they didn't have the evidence to get it over the line, I don't know what was going on behind the scenes, but doesn't mean it didn't happen. Where there's smoke, there's fire. And then goes on to say, to compare Islam Makhachev to O.J. Simpson. Meanwhile, Ariel Helwani's still in the background, laughing like a little schoolgirl. And I just find this to be just laughable. Ariel considers himself a journalist. He literally considers himself a journalist. And he's just not asking any follow-up questions that people want to know. And you can't just say, oh, where there's smoke, there's fire, just because you heard, supposedly, with no evidence, that someone dropped off an IV to Islam Makhachev. That's what you heard. And you just say where there's smoke, there's fire? So does that mean every allegation that is ever brought up from anyone, it has to be considered true, even with no evidence? Does that mean your teammate, Israel Adesanya, who everyone accuses of using PEDs, does that mean automatically they're on PEDs? And Ariel doesn't ask anything. He just sits there giggling. Oh, he caught Islam Makhachev, O.J. Simpson. That's so funny. Ariel never asks, what evidence do you have? Can you share this evidence with us? And we're going to look at a clip from their manager in a second, or not their manager, Volkanovski's manager. I'm not sure if it's Hooker's manager, which sheds even more light on this situation. But nothing. Imagine your entire case to accuse someone and attempt to devalue their entire legacy and devalue a championship win, one of the best of their career, is, yeah, where there's smoke, there's fire. Where there's smoke, there's fire. That's absolutely ridiculous and ludicrous. And meanwhile, you have someone who claims, and we're going to talk about Ariel Helwani in a second, but claims to be about the truth, is just laughing like a schoolgirl and not even asking decent follow-up questions. Let's take a look at one more clip from Dan Hooker.
So you believe that some funny business went down? You still believe that? Nothing has happened?
100%. In my opinion, it was Islam Makhachev that took the Ivy. Like, that's like my opinion. Do I think that it was like... I feel like it potentially might have been like a genuine misunderstanding of the rules. Like, we saw from like my outburst and then like USADA's clarification and then the backlash, like there's still a lot of like misunderstanding about the actual rule. Like, I couldn't even tell you the actual rule. Like, so USADA's like absolutely fine with it if you get a nurse to do it.
So there, Ariel asked him yet again, do you believe that there was some funny business going on here? Do you believe that Islam Makhachev took an IV and cheated in the lead up to UFC 284? And Dan Hooker goes 100%, in my opinion. Well, wait a second. Don't you have evidence? Isn't there evidence here? In your opinion? Well, wait a second. This doesn't make any sense to me. And Ariel doesn't ask him, well, what evidence do you have to support this claim? Because the only thing that Dan Hooker has said so far is that a nurse contacted their team and said that they dropped off an IV to Islam Makhachev. Well, that could have been anyone. That could have been a fan playing a prank and say, yeah, we gave an IV to Islam Makhachev. It just doesn't add up. There's no real evidence. What it comes down to is Dan Hooker. This is just him and his team being salty, and they're just making claims for why Volkanovski lost fair and square to Islam Makhachev, because there is no evidence that he took an IV. And then on top of that, just to rub salt in the wound, Dan Hooker goes, yeah, I don't even know what the rule is. Well, wait a second. If you don't know what the rule is, then why'd you accuse him of cheating if you didn't even know that he was cheating because you don't know the rule? Because the rule is, based on USADA rules, is that a medical professional can administer an IV if they deem it's medically necessary. Now, in Australia, it's a whole different ballgame because it's outright banned in Australia, but that's besides the point, because there's no evidence that Islam Makhachev took an IV, and Ariel Helwani doesn't even ask. How are you listening to this story and not saying, well, what evidence do you have? I would love to know the evidence that you have. Can you share some with us? What makes you think this? He's just holding on to the claim that some nurse somewhere, an anonymous nurse where he has no proof is actually even a nurse, oh, they dropped off an IV somewhere. And I want to take a look at what Alexander Volkanovski's manager said, because it sheds some more light on this entire nurse situation. And I just find it hilarious because whenever the people from this situation talk about it, whether it be Dan Hooker in those clips I just showed you, or Volkanovski's manager, they start to get really weird and really awkward, and it almost seem like they're drunk because they're stumbling over their words because they don't know what to say, because the only thing they can say is the truth, which is we have no evidence. So let's take a look at a clip from Volkanovski's manager from a little while ago on the MMA Hour.
Like tweeting and stuff like that. On the Monday after that fight, there was a whole hullabaloo with tweets, right? Has that just died? Is there anything left to all of that? You know, the IV stuff. Is that all dead, or?
Oh, look, mate, that's, you know.
Is that Dan's story to tell?
Yeah, look, I mean, I'll touch on it. Like,
so before we get into the rest of that clip, I wanted to pause it right there because did you hear that long, awkward laugh and then staring down into the table? Essentially, oh no, I got a delay because I don't know what to say here. Before he says, oh, well, I'll touch on it. And then you hear Ariel Helwani say, well, is that Dan's story to tell? Basically giving him an out, but we'll talk about Ariel at the end of this video. But let's hear what the manager, let's see what he has to say after this.
Like, we were given information from the company that did it. So, you know, and whether, but I will go out and say this, that I don't know who did it. I'm not going to sit here and say that, but like what we were given is information that happened, but I don't know who did it.
Meaning that, who took the IV?
What athlete, or if any at all. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? So like, and that's it. So obviously, that's it. Like, and so whether it did or it didn't, like where there's smoke, there's fire. And it's just fucking burning. Sorry for swearing.
Talk about an absolute word salad. I don't know who did it or if any athlete did it. Well, wait a second. What is this guy talking about? We got information from a company, but we don't know who did it or if anyone did it. But where there's smoke, there's fire? What are we listening to right here? And Ariel's like, yeah, makes sense to me. I mean, seriously, if this isn't the biggest idiotic statement I've ever heard in my entire life, and I left that long pause in the beginning because he had laughed before that, and then he longly paused because he doesn't know what to say, because there's no evidence. They have embarrassed themselves. Oh, I don't know who did it or if anyone did it, but we got some information that maybe somebody did it. I mean, talk about an embarrassment. This is one of the most embarrassing clips I've ever seen. I cannot believe that people are actually buying this up and saying, oh, well, there's injection marks. Well, talk about injection marks. Well, there's blood work done the day before the fight or 2 days before the fight, so that can easily be dispelled. And then you have this guy saying, well, we got word from the company that did it, but we don't know who did it or if any fighter did it. So what he's saying is, we know absolutely nothing about what happened with Islam Makhachev in his IV situation. So Dan Hooker should be embarrassed of himself. Volkanovski's manager should be embarrassed of himself. Volkanovski hasn't said much about the situation, but Dan Hooker has literally stained Alexander Volkanovski with this. And he has ruined one of the best fights of the year, in my opinion. And I hope, and this sucks because I love the fight, I hope Islam Makhachev never fights Alexander Volkanovski again. And that hurts to say as a fan. But they deserve to be penalized for this. I hope Dan Hooker's cut if he loses to Jalen Turner. But unfortunately, Jalen Turner screwed that all up by missing weight. Now it's going to be, Dan Hooker's going to be crying after this. Oh, he missed weight by 2 pounds, which, I mean, he has a right to cry about that. But it's not like he doesn't have any evidence of that. We know because he stepped on a scale. So I just think this entire debacle is an embarrassment, and I hope Islam Makhachev refuses to fight Alexander Volkanovski ever again. And Ariel was even more embarrassing than the manager and Dan Hooker, in my opinion, because he just sat there, he nodded, he smiled, he never asked any follow-up questions, because Ariel Helwani has an axe to grind. This guy is the king of, I want to set the record straight. I want to set it straight when Brendan Schaub says this about me or Patty Pimblett says this about me, and I'm bringing out receipts. But he lets these people make baseless claims, potentially affecting the legacy of certain fighters with no reasonable follow-up questions. This guy is putting these people on his show, giving them a voice in the MMA community because he's one of the biggest shows in MMA, and he's not even asking them simple follow-up questions. Isn't that what he clowns on the people who go to UFC events and the UFC press conferences? Oh, well, they're just publicity for the UFC and they don't even ask any tough questions. Well, what are you doing here? And the reason he's doing this is because he does not like Ali Abdelaziz. Not a lot of people like Ali Abdelaziz in the media because of the way he acts towards media, and rightfully so. But Ariel lets it cloud his judgment. He is eating this up, and he is enjoying it because it is affecting Ali Abdelaziz's fighter in Islam Makhachev. And I just think Ariel Helwani should be embarrassed of himself. Why? With such huge claims, one of the biggest claims you can make in MMA is that someone is cheating by using some type of performance enhancer. And an IV was banned where you couldn't just use it whenever you wanted to because speculations of using those to mask PEDs. So essentially Dan Hooker here, even though he said, I don't know if he did it maliciously or not, which doesn't really matter. You're claiming that he did it with no evidence. Ariel's just letting these claims just fly by, and he's just like, and it's all because he does not like Ali Abdelaziz, who is the manager of Islam Makhachev. Ariel's not a journalist. Ariel, he picks and chooses when he wants to actually find the truth. And I've said from the beginning, if someone broke the rules, if someone violated USADA policies, I want them punished. If there's evidence to support it, I want there to be an investigation and I want there to be a punishment. But Dan Hooker provided nothing. All he's done is provide baseless claims and then say, where there's smoke, there's fire. And Volkanovski's manager said the same thing. Well, you know what? I heard that Dan Hooker and his manager here, or Volkanovski's manager, I think his name is Ash something. I heard that they're both having sexual encounters with kangaroos. That's what I heard. That's just what I heard. Somebody called me from a company and told me that. And where there's smoke, there's fire. So it's on them to disprove it. That's 100% true. That's all the evidence I need to make that claim. I just think this is ridiculous. I mean, this sounds so stupid. And I'm just so sick and tired of people in the MMA community getting to push out these narratives and then nobody's even checking them. Nobody's checking them. Everyone just runs with it. Everyone's run with Islam Makhachev's a cheater. Islam Makhachev took an IV, and that's the only reason he beat Volkanovski. And people are saying he didn't even actually beat Volkanovski. People are saying that. And meanwhile, there's no actual evidence, and people will talk about this in the MMA community for years to come. I think Dan Hooker and Volkanovski's manager has absolutely embarrassed themselves along with Ariel Helwani, and people need to let them know. That's why I had to make this video. Not that they're necessarily going to see it, but I wanted to make this video because no one's following up on the situation. You can just make a claim, 5 months ago, never even provide any evidence, and it just sticks like it's concrete. So I hope Dan Hooker gets cut from the organization. The only reason Dan Hooker did this is because sour grapes regarding his teammate and training partner Volkanovski losing. Meanwhile, Islam Makhachev ripped his arm off a couple years ago, and Dan Hooker screamed out. He didn't even tap. He screamed to the ref, please stop it. And he's salty about that. He's going through a midlife crisis, and he's making baseless claims with no evidence. Meanwhile, Ariel Helwani is boosting it in the MMA media. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe, and thank you so much for watching.